Equine-Assisted Therapy, an Evaluation of an Unfounded Intervention by Megan Hunter. What is equine-assisted therapy? It's an intervention that uses an equine, typically a horse, to assist an individual, often with a disability, to improve motor skills, language skills, overall behavior skills, as well as social skills. The strong connection between horse and rider has been well established through history. Activities for the intervention include basic horse care techniques such as brushing, use of equipment, up through more advanced skills such as riding and horsemanship. Who can benefit from equine therapy? There have been documented cases for individuals with autism, emotional disabilities, behavior disabilities, as well as cognitive impairments, abuse victims, and those with multiple impairments. So what does the research tell us about equine-assisted therapy? Unfortunately, most of the case studies that are available rely largely on anecdotal data. The intervention itself is difficult to generalize, especially across settings, since horses are not typically present in classrooms, other parts of the community. Therefore, that leaves equine-assisted therapy a largely unfounded intervention or therapy at this point. Some would even question whether or not it's just a fad, something that is being targeted for those parents that are somewhat desperate and looking for something, anything that can show improvement for their child or children. So for the purposes of this mock research project, the case that I created involved 4 males with autism ranging in cognitive abilities. All 4 males had previously exhibited pretty significant physically aggressive behaviors towards others, both at school and in the home situation. All 4 participants participated in therapy sessions that were twice a week for an entire college semester. There's one session during the week and an evening after school, and then another one on Saturday mornings. The independent variable for this case study was the use of the equine-assisted therapy along with positive reinforcement for compliance with behaviors. And the dependent variable, or the target behavior examined, was the physical aggression for all 4 male participants. For the design of this mock case study, I decided on a multiple baseline over participants due to the lack of generalizability of equine-assisted therapy in general. For example, multiple baseline over settings or cross settings would not be applicable for the equine-assisted therapy intervention because horses don't go to school. You often don't see or never see horses in the community. So settings just didn't really allow itself. During baseline, data was collected and initial instructional lessons were provided to the participants in the barn. These initial lessons did not involve horses, but they were in the barn to allow for the participants to acclimate themselves to that new setting. And these lessons involved things like sweeping, putting things away in the barn, and other things where the participants had to comply with directives. Baseline, as previously stated, data was collected and all sessions were recorded. There were multiple recorders and observers to account for inter-observer reliability, as well as just to make improvements throughout the study. While the studies look promising in terms of outcomes for participants involved with equine-assisted therapy, there continues to be a need for additional data that is not exclusively anecdotal, something hard and fast that we can really determine is it the equine assisted therapy that is causing the improvements in behavior. At this point, most researchers are looking at this as a complementary therapy, and it's not, certainly not a replacement for ABA. As therapists, we do still have obligation to inform parents and caregivers that this is a complementary intervention and it's not something that we should abandon all other therapies in replace of, but studies are showing that there is some improvement for participants. So basically, the procedures for baseline sessions and the therapy sessions, those involving the equine, the procedures were basically the same. The difference, of course, between baseline and intervention sessions being the presence or absence of that horse. Positive reinforcement was given for compliance across baseline and intervention sessions. Directives were provided along with wait time for all directives given to clients. The prompting levels were then increased if the participant either refused to or failed to comply with the directive, or if they exhibited a behavior other than what the directive was. This graph shows the results for participant 1, or Joe, as he's referred to in the study. Joe participated in 5 baseline sessions before it was determined that his physically aggressive behaviors had stabilized around that 20 instance mark. So intervention or the horse was implemented to the instructional sessions beginning at session 6. His physically aggressive behaviors did decrease over the course of the treatment somewhat gradually, as you can see represented on the graph, until finally that last session he still exhibited 6 instances of physically aggressive behavior towards the interventionists. This graph represents the results for participant 2, or Tim. The equine assisted therapy sessions began at session 9 after baseline stabilized. As you can see represented by the graph, there were some initial spikes in physical aggression during the course of treatment, but overall physically aggressive behaviors did decrease. This graph shows the results for participant 3, or Josh, as he's referred to in the study. As you can see, his baseline stabilized very quickly. The clinicians even gave him a few extra sessions of baseline just to make sure that that 30 instance mark really was the point at which those behaviors stabilized during baseline. And also, as you can see from the graph, he was able to reduce those instances of physical aggression to only 2 instances in the last few sessions. And this graph shows the results for participant 4, or Andrew. He remained in baseline for the longest amount of time and also had the highest instances of physical aggression towards the clinicians. As you can see represented by the graph, he was able to decrease those instances of physical aggression through the course of treatment. So after looking at all of the graphs, we can see that all 4 participants were able to reduce those instances of physically aggressive behavior during the equine assisted therapy sessions. Post-treatment interviews were conducted with the parents of all the participants. These interviews were conducted 1 week after the therapy sessions had ended and then 1 month following the end of the therapy sessions. All parents reported that those physically aggressive behaviors had returned, though they initially decreased at home once the therapy sessions had ceased. It's important to note, too, that this data is anecdotal. There are no follow-up probes or anything to determine the level at which those participants are engaging in the physically aggressive behaviors, but parents did feel that this intervention benefited their sons and were looking to pursue the equine assisted therapy sessions for the following semester. It's also important to look at some of the limitations of this case study as well as other case studies involving equine assisted therapy. Equine assisted therapy is not easily generalizable to other settings. Each of the 4 participants in this particular study exhibited physically aggressive behaviors in other settings as well, primarily the classroom or the school environment. And it's not easy to implement a program or therapy like this in a school setting, as I'm sure you can imagine. There's also no indication that these skills are maintained once the therapy sessions are over. As the parents indicated in their 1 week and 1 month post interview, all of the physical aggression returned. Granted, that is anecdotal data and without additional probes to determine with what frequency, duration, or intensity those behaviors returned, it is still somewhat subjective. And it's important to remember that equine assisted therapy is a complementary therapy, not a cure, not a fix, not something that should replace other scientifically based interventions. So, what is the future of equine assisted therapy as an intervention for individuals with autism? Ultimately, the research needs to catch up with the popularity of the intervention, and that research needs to include more quantitative data as opposed to relying mostly on anecdotal data or other subjective measures. Is it a fad? Perhaps at this point it is. We need to think of it as a complementary therapy at this point, as opposed to a replacement for another scientifically based intervention. And definitely keep that in mind when having conversations with parents. So, thank you for your time, and I hope that you learned something about equine assisted therapy through this mock case study.